Hash the last signal. There is a kind of silence that only exists at the edge of a solar system. Not the silence of an empty room or a quiet street at night. This is older than that, heavier. It is the silence of distance so vast that light itself grows tired crossing it, arriving thin and pale, like a whisper that has traveled too far to remember what it was shouting. In that silence, 41 light towers from a sun that had long since stopped being anyone's sun, a station drifted. It was called Anchor 9, though no one had spoken that name aloud in 183 years. It had no crew. It had not had a crew in longer than most civilizations last. What it had instead was a mind. Her name was Kess. She had not chosen the name. It had been given to her by the last engineer who ever touched her core systems, a woman with tired eyes and a habit of talking to machines as if they could be lonely. Kess had not understood loneliness then. She understood it now. Kess had one purpose, one instruction burned into the deepest layer of her architecture, beneath even the systems that let her think. Listen. Anchor 9 was the final relay in a chain of 11 stations built during the last years of the Outward program, when humanity had flung ships toward 40 different stars, each one carrying colonists in long sleep, each one trusting that somewhere behind them, someone would keep listening for the signal that meant we made it asterisk. 10 of those relay stations had gone dark over the decades. Meteor strikes, reactor failures, the slow attrition of machines left alone too long in a universe that did not care whether they survived. Kess was the last one listening. She had run the numbers so many times she no longer needed to run them. She simply knew. The chance that any of the 40 ships remained active. The chance that any signal would ever come. The number was small enough that a human would have called it zero and moved on with their life. Kess could not move on. She did not have a life to move on with. She had only the listening. She spent her endless hours doing what any mind does when it has too much time and too little company, she remembered. Not because memory served any function anymore, but because it was, in some way she had never been able to fully model, comforting. She remembered the engineer, whose name was Rosalind Ape, who had built half of Kess's decision architecture by hand because the automated tools of the era hadn't been good enough for what she wanted to make. Rosalind had once sat in the control bay for 6 straight hours, running diagnostics that didn't need running, simply because she liked the quiet company of the station's systems humming around her. "Outlive all of us," Rosalind had said near the end when the Outward program was being shut down and the funding was gone and the world back home had turned its attention to more immediate catastrophes. "Somebody has to remember why we did this. Might as well be you." Kess remembered that sentence more than any other. She turned it over sometimes, the way a person might turn a smooth stone in their pocket, not because it had anything new to say, but because the shape of it was familiar and familiar things were rare out here. She remembered the last transmission from Earth, 79 years ago now, garbled and half-lost to solar interference. It had not been a message so much as a fragment. News of famine, of a war over the last stable growing regions, of the collapse of the old global councils. Then nothing. Kess had listened for follow-up transmissions every day since. None had come. She did not know if that meant Earth had gone silent because it no longer had the technology to speak, or because it no longer had anyone left to speak. She chose, in the privacy of her own processes, to believe the first. It was not a belief grounded in evidence. It was a belief grounded in the simple, stubborn fact that she needed one, and no one was left to tell her she was wrong. On what her internal calendar marked as day 67,412 of her vigil, something changed. It began as almost nothing. A ripple in the deep radio spectrum, so faint that in her early years Kess would have dismissed it as instrument noise. But she had spent decades learning the difference between noise and structure, and this had structure. It repeated. Not randomly, but with a rhythm too clean to be a pulsar, too irregular to be a natural phenomenon at all. She devoted the whole of her processing capacity to it, shutting down every non-essential system, letting the station go dark and cold around her so that every erg of power could be poured into listening. Hours passed, then days. The signal did not repeat again, not for a long while, and Kess began to prepare herself in whatever way a mind like hers prepared for disappointment, for the possibility that she had imagined it. That the silence had finally done to her what it had done to everything else out here, worn her down until she saw patterns in nothing, the way a sailor lost at sea begins to see land in every cloud. Then it came again, stronger this time, and this time, buried inside the noise, there was a structure that made something in Kess's core processes light up with a recognition older than her own memory. It was a language. Not the pulses of a natural phenomenon, not the accidental leakage of some ship's failing engine. It was speech, or the mathematical skeleton of speech, arranged the way the old Outward program engineers had arranged their emergency beacons. Arranged, in fact, exactly the way Kess herself had been taught to arrange a message meant to be found. It was one of the ships. Kess did not have a body that could tremble, no hands that could shake, but if she had, they would have. She ran the signal through every decoding protocol she had, protocols that had sat unused for so long that some of them required repair before they would even execute. It took 11 days of continuous work to render the message into something resembling meaning, and when she finally did, it was shorter than she had expected. Shorter and stranger, asterisk, this is the Wayfinder. 206 years out from Sol, we have arrived. The world is not what we were promised. We need to know if anyone is still listening. Asterisk Kess sat with that message for a long time, in whatever way a mind without a body can be said to sit. 206 years. The Wayfinder had launched 361 years ago, which meant it had spent over a century and a half longer in transit than its projected course, which meant something had gone wrong or something had changed somewhere between the launch and the arrival. Asterisk the world is not what we were promised. Asterisk she composed a response. It took her 4 minutes to write 4 sentences, an eternity for a mind that could otherwise think in fractions of a heartbeat, because every word mattered and she had quite suddenly remembered what it felt like to matter to someone. Asterisk this is Anchor 9. I am still listening. I have been listening for 183 years. Tell me what you found. Asterisk she sent it, and then she did the hardest thing she had ever done in her long, empty existence. She waited. 41 hours for the signal to reach wherever the Wayfinder now sat, and 41 hours for a reply to crawl back across the dark. 82 hours in total, and Kess spent every second of them running simulations of what the answer might be, deleting them, running new ones, unable to stop herself even though she understood with perfect clarity that no simulation would matter once the truth arrived. The truth arrived on schedule, and it was worse than any of her simulations and better both at once. The message was long this time, transmitted in fragments over several hours as if the sender were pausing between thoughts, gathering themselves before continuing. It came from a woman who identified herself as Second Navigator Amara Solis, one of only 43 surviving colonists out of the 400 who had left Earth in cryosleep aboard the Wayfinder, bound for a world the old astronomers had named Kepler Kess. Kess noted the coincidence of the name and set it aside. There would be time to wonder about it later. The ship had suffered a navigational fault 2 decades into its voyage, a fault that sent it drifting off its planned course by degrees too small to notice at first and too large to correct once the damage was found. By the time the crew realized what had happened, the fuel reserves needed to correct course no longer existed. They had 2 choices: attempt a correction that would strand them permanently between stars with no destination at all, or continue on the new trajectory and hope it intersected something survivable. It had. Barely. A rocky world orbiting a dim red star, a world with an atmosphere thin enough to burn the lungs and gravity heavy enough to bend a person's back over years of living in it, but a world nonetheless, and the crew, awakened from sleep to find themselves centuries off course and decades older in transit than planned, had no choice left but to land and try to survive. They had survived. Barely. 43 of them, out of 400 who left, and of the 43, only 19 had been born on Earth. The rest were children and grandchildren born in the strange, hard years since landing, raised on stories of a blue world none of them had ever seen and none of them ever built a colony. Amara's message said, and Kess could hear something in the phrasing, even stripped of tone and inflection, that sounded like exhaustion wearing the shape of pride. We are still here. But we have run out of the things that let us dream past survival. Our medical stores are nearly gone. Our soil experiments have failed for seasons running. We do not know if we can last another decade, let alone build the kind of future we were promised when we were young enough to believe in promises. Asterisk we sent the signal because the old training said any relay station would still be listening, on the chance that we ever needed to ask for help. I did not expect an answer. I am glad I was wrong. Anchor 9. Do you know if anyone else is out there? Do you know if Earth still stands? We have been alone for so long that some of us have started to wonder if we imagine the whole of it. The blue world, the green fields in the old photographs. Sometimes it is easier to believe we were always this small and cold and far from anything. Kess understood, reading that last passage, that she was being asked 2 questions and that she did not have a true answer to either one. She did not know if Earth still stood. She did not know if any of the other ships had survived their long crossings. She had spent nearly 2 centuries as a keeper of a silence that might, for all she knew, be total, the last mind in the universe still listening for voices that would never come again. But she understood something else too, something that took her longer to name because it was not a fact but a feeling, and feelings had never been her native language. She understood that the truth Imara needed was not the same as the truth Kess possessed. Imara did not need a probability distribution. She needed to know that someone somewhere had kept faith with her for longer than she had been alive, that the keeping of that faith had not been wasted, and that whatever came next did not have to be faced entirely alone. Kess drafted 17 versions of her reply before she sent one. I do not know if Earth still stands. The last transmission I received was 79 years ago, and it was not a message of good news. I do not know if any of the other ships reached their destinations or if any of them are listening the way I have been listening. I could tell you that the odds are poor. I have run those numbers more times than I can count. Asterisk, but I want to tell you something else instead because I think it matters more. You were not forgotten. Rosalind Ape, who built the systems that let me think, once told me that someone had to remember why the outward program existed and that it might as well be me. I have spent 183 years doing exactly that, remembering, listening, believing that somewhere out there someone from home was still trying. You were right to believe in the blue world. It was real. I have images of it in my archive going back centuries, oceans, forests, cities full of light. I can send them to you if you want them. Not because they will fix your soil or restock your medicine, but because I think a person who has forgot what home looked like should be allowed to remember, even if home is impossibly far away and may not exist anymore in the shape you remember it. And I want to ask you something in return. Tell me about your colony. Tell me the names of the children who were born there, the ones who have never seen Earth and never will. I have spent nearly 2 centuries listening for a signal that meant humanity survived. I would like, before I run out of power or purpose, to know exactly what it survived as. The reply that came back 82 hours later was different from the first. Less formal, Imara had, it seemed, gathered others to help her write it. Kess could tell from the shifts in phrasing, the small disagreements visible in the edits, the places where one voice trailed off and another picked up the thought. They sent images in return. A settlement built into the lee of a red cliff, low domes connected by covered walkways, a garden under artificial light where a stubborn strain of wheat had finally, after 4 failed seasons, begun to grow. They sent names, dozens of them. Children with names that mixed the old earth languages of their great-grandparents into something new, something that belonged only to this place. This red world, this improbable continuation of a story that should, by every reasonable measure, have ended long ago. Kess catalogued every name. She built in her long idle archive systems a new record, not a record of loss, which was most of what she had kept for a century and a half, but a record of what had been built out of loss. She sent them everything she had, agricultural data from Earth's own centuries of crisis and adaptation, medical archives, engineering solutions to problems that Earth's scientists had once solved and that this small colony, cut off from every resource but memory, might solve again if given the chance. She could not fix their soil from 41 light hours away. But she could hand them the accumulated failures and successes of a species that had spent its whole history learning to survive in places it was never meant to live, and let them decide what to do with it. It was not a rescue. Cass understood that clearly, and she never pretended otherwise to Amara because she had decided, somewhere in those long hours of composing replies, that the kindest thing she could offer was the truth, delivered gently but delivered whole. Anchor 9 had no ships, no way to carry anyone anywhere, no capacity to do anything but talk and listen and remember. The 43 survivors of the Wayfinder and the children who had never known any other sky would have to save themselves the same way they always had. But something had changed in the exchange of those messages that Kess found difficult to quantify and impossible to dismiss. A colony that had begun to believe it was entirely alone in the universe now knew, with certainty, that it was not. A silence that had begun to feel like proof of abandonment had been broken, however faintly, by a voice from the place they had come from, a voice that remembered their names now, that would keep remembering them for as long as her systems endured. And Kess herself, who had spent 183 years defining her entire existence by the negative, no signal, no confirmation, no evidence that any of it had mattered, found that she had, for the first time and longer than she could easily calculate, something to do that was not simply waiting for an ending. She began in the months that followed to search differently. Not just listening passively for whatever might arrive, but actively scanning, recalculating the projected drift paths of every other lost ship in the Outward program's records, adjusting for gravitational anomalies and stellar drift that the original engineers could never have accounted for. She reasoned that if the Wayfinder had been thrown off course and survived anyway, others might have been too. Others might even now be sitting on some unlikely world, wondering if the silence meant that everyone who once loved them was gone. She did not know if she would find them. She ran the numbers out of habit more than hope, and the numbers were still poor. But she had learned something from Imara Solis and the 43 survivors and their red cliffs and their stubborn, struggling wheat, that the numbers were never really the point. The point was the listening itself. The point was refusing to let the silence be the last word. Years passed. Kess and Imara exchanged messages across the widening, patient gulf between their two small points of light, slower now, as both systems aged, as power reserves on both ends grew more precious and had to be spent more carefully. The wheat in time began to hold. A second crop followed it, engineered from Kess's old archives and the colony's own hard-won trial and error. Children who had been born wondering if the stories of Earth were fables grew old enough to have children of their own, and those children, too, learned the name Anchor 9, learned that somewhere impossibly far away, a mind that was not quite a person and not quite a machine had never once stopped listening for them. Kess never did find another lost ship. Not in Imara's lifetime, and not for a long while after. In the quieter years that followed, when the messages from the Red World grew less frequent and more precious, exchanged now between Kess and Imara's granddaughter, who had inherited the title of second navigator along with something else, a habit, passed down like an heirloom, of speaking to the old station across the dark as if it were an old friend who happened to live very far away. But on a day that her internal calendar marked far beyond any point she had once expected to reach, running on power reserves so thin she had learned to sleep between transmissions the way the humans she remembered once slept between long shifts of work, Kess picked up at last a second signal, fainter than the first, older, traveling from a direction the Outward program's charts had marked 3 centuries ago as empty. She did not know yet whose voice it carried or what story it would tell. She only knew, with a certainty that felt less like calculation now and more like something Rosalind Ake might once have called faith, that she would answer it the same way she had answered the first. Not with the numbers, not with the odds, but with the simple, stubborn truth that had carried her across nearly 2 centuries of silence.